It's 1807, and Thomas Jefferson is sitting in the White House with what he believes is a genuinely brilliant idea. The British and the French are harassing American ships, stealing cargo and conscripting sailors into foreign navies. So Jefferson decides to hit back, not with warships, not with diplomacy, but by telling every American merchant to stop trading with the entire world. History has a funny way of reminding us that power and wisdom are not the same thing. The United States has had 46 presidents, and every single one of them has made economic decisions with real consequences for real people. Some of those decisions were bold and brilliant. Others were the economic equivalent of pouring gasoline on a campfire and calling it climate control. Today, we are looking at 6 of the worst business decisions ever made by sitting American presidents. Decisions that tanked entire industries, triggered financial panics, started global trade wars, and cost ordinary Americans hundreds of billions of dollars. Not rogue executives, not out-of-touch hedge fund managers. Presidents, the most powerful economic decision makers on Earth, making some of the most expensive mistakes in recorded history. At the time, every single one of these decisions came with a perfectly logical explanation. They always do. Let's start with Jefferson and the Embargo Act of 1807. By that year, America was the Switzerland of the Atlantic, a neutral trading nation quietly making good money selling goods to both Britain and France, while those two powers tried to destroy each other. Jefferson, who had spent years warning about European entanglements, decided that neutrality was no longer enough. Britain was boarding American ships, impressing sailors into the Royal Navy, and treating the United States like a colonial afterthought. So Jefferson pushed through the Embargo Act, which essentially told American merchants, no more exports, no more imports, effective immediately. Plan was simple enough. Starve Britain and France of American goods until they agreed to respect American sovereignty. European governments barely noticed. American merchants absolutely noticed. New England's shipping industry collapsed almost overnight. Ports that had been handling millions of dollars in trade went quiet. Some estimates put the economic damage at over 8% of gross domestic product in a single year. Farmers in the South couldn't export their crops. Merchants in Boston couldn't move their goods. Smuggling became so widespread that Jefferson had to deploy federal agents to the Canadian border just to stop the bleeding. Turns out, you cannot wage economic warfare against 2 global superpowers when your own economy depends on trading with them. By 1809, even Jefferson's allies in Congress couldn't defend the policy anymore. The Embargo Act was repealed after just 15 months, one of the shortest-lived and most destructive pieces of legislation in early American history. Jefferson called it an honest experiment. American merchants had a different set of words for it. Andrew Jackson's great economic disaster was more ideological. In 1832, the Second Bank of the United States was effectively the country's central bank. It regulated lending, stabilized the currency, and kept the financial system from flying apart at the seams. Jackson hated it. He believed it was a corrupt institution run by elite bankers who were manipulating the economy for personal gain. He wasn't entirely wrong, but his solution made things considerably worse. Jackson vetoed the bank's rechartering and then, just to make sure it stayed dead, withdrew all federal deposits and distributed them to state-chartered banks that critics immediately dubbed pet banks. The idea was to democratize finance, spread power away from a centralized institution, and let free markets handle the rest. Behind the scenes, the reality looked very different. Without central regulation, state banks began issuing paper currency backed by almost nothing. Land speculation exploded. Credit expanded in ways that had nothing to do with actual economic productivity. By 1836, the situation had become so unstable that Jackson issued the Specie Circular, demanding that government land purchases be paid in gold or silver, which immediately triggered a credit contraction. By 1837, 1 year after Jackson left office, the United States was in the middle of a full banking panic. Over 600 banks failed. Unemployment soared. The economy didn't fully recover for nearly a decade. It was like dismantling a dam because you didn't trust the engineers who built it, and then watching the valley flood in slow motion. Herbert Hoover's contribution to this list arrived at possibly the worst moment in American economic history. The stock market had just crashed in 1929. Banks were failing. The economy was contracting fast, and Hoover's answer was to sign the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, raising tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods to the highest levels in nearly a century. The logic was to protect American jobs by making foreign products more expensive, which sounds reasonable until you remember that other countries also have governments. More than 1,000 economists signed a public letter begging Hoover not to sign it. He signed it anyway. Within months, Canada, Britain, Germany, France, and dozens of other trading partners had retaliated with their own tariffs. American exports collapsed by 61% between 1929 and 1933. Meanwhile, economists across the political spectrum described Smoot Hawley as one of the clearest examples of a policy that turned a bad recession into the Great Depression. By 1932, unemployment had reached 25%. Guess what was not helping? The Smoot-Hawley Act became so infamous that it ended up in Ferris Bueller's Day Off as the world's most boring economics lecture. Even Hollywood knew it was a disaster. In August 1971, Richard Nixon did something that rewired the entire global financial system in a single weekend. Since 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement had tied global currencies to the dollar and tied the dollar to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. It was stable, predictable, and understood by every major economy on Earth. Kind of like the rules of Monopoly before someone flips the board. Nixon flipped the board. Nixon had a problem. The Vietnam War was expensive, social programs were expensive, the United States was running deficits, and foreign governments were converting their dollars into gold at an alarming rate. So, on a Sunday night in August, he went on television and announced that the United States was ending the dollar's convertibility to gold. No international agreement, no transition plan, no warning. At first, nothing seemed catastrophically wrong. Then the consequences arrived. Exchange rates that had been fixed for decades started floating freely. Inflation accelerated sharply. By the mid-1970s, the United States was experiencing stagflation, simultaneously high inflation and high unemployment, which economists had previously thought was basically impossible. The dollar lost a significant portion of its purchasing power over the following decade. Nixon called it a temporary measure. It became permanent, and the ripple effects of that Sunday night announcement are still shaping global currency markets today. Jimmy Carter's disaster was subtler, which almost makes it worse. In 1980, Carter signed legislation deregulating the savings and loan industry, the network of community banks and thrift institutions that helped ordinary Americans buy homes and save for retirement. The idea was to free these institutions from restrictions so they could compete in a high-interest rate environment. What nobody fully anticipated was that deregulating an industry without strengthening its oversight was like handing someone the car keys and removing every guardrail on the highway. Savings and loan executives, suddenly freed from restrictions on risky investments, began asking a very simple question. Are these investments legal? Technically, yes. Great, let's do them all. And they did. Depositor money poured into commercial real estate speculation and junk bonds that had no business being funded by federally insured deposits. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Then the real estate market started cracking. By the late 1980s, savings and loan institutions were failing at a rate not seen since the Great Depression. The federal government had to step in. The final cost to American taxpayers was approximately $124 billion. At the time, one of the most expensive financial bailouts in the country's history. More than 1,000 institutions failed. The chief executive of one collapsed institution famously argued he hadn't done anything illegal. Many executives across the industry made the same argument. Some of them were technically correct. That was precisely the problem. Donald Trump's trade war with China began in 2018, with a premise that had genuine economic logic behind it. China had been engaging in unfair trade practices for years, stealing intellectual property, blocking American companies from competing in Chinese markets, and running a trade surplus that had hollowed out entire American industries. Addressing this was a legitimate goal. The execution, however, was a tariff blitz, unlike anything the modern global economy had seen. By 2019, the United States had imposed tariffs on more than $360 billion worth of Chinese goods. China retaliated by targeting American agricultural exports. Soybeans, pork, corn, products that came almost entirely from the same rural communities that had most enthusiastically supported the tariffs. American farmers lost approximately $27 billion in export sales to China between 2018 and 2019. The federal government then paid out billions in agricultural subsidies to offset the damage, which means American taxpayers were compensating American farmers for the direct consequences of an American policy. Meanwhile, Chinese manufacturers adapted, rerouted supply chains through Vietnam and other countries, and continued selling products to American consumers through intermediaries. Consumer prices on electronics, furniture, and clothing rose noticeably. The trade deficit with China, which the tariffs were supposed to reduce, actually increased in 2018. Turns out trade wars are not, as promised, easy to win. 6 presidents, 6 decisions made with genuine conviction, each backed by reasoning that seemed sound at the time. Jefferson wanted to defend American sovereignty. Jackson wanted to break up elite financial power. Hoover wanted to protect American jobs. Nixon wanted to stabilize a struggling economy. Carter wanted to modernize a struggling industry. Trump wanted to push back against a rival that had been operating by a different set of rules for decades. Every single one of them made things considerably worse. If Jefferson had chosen targeted diplomacy over a blanket trade embargo, New England merchants might have kept their livelihoods and the United States might have found a smarter path to international respect. If Jackson had chosen to reform the second bank rather than destroy it, the Panic of 1837 might never have happened, and hundreds of thousands of ordinary Americans might have been spared years of economic hardship. If Hoover had simply listened to those 1,000 economists, the Great Depression might have remained a manageable recession. But they didn't. And the lesson, if there is one, is that the most confident economic decisions in history are sometimes the most expensive ones.